with that, I will go ahead and bring Jerry McLaughlin on. While he comes on board, I will go ahead and share out my screen quick. Just to introduce...
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Charles.
And just for the introduction here, Jerry is the Senior Product Manager for Identity and User ID at Palo Alto Networks. And we're really lucky to have him here today. Jerry, with that, I will turn the show over to you. It's all yours.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to find the specific tab here, and we'll share that. So is that full screen for everybody, Charles?
Pretty close enough, yes.
Okay, because it's a small on my screen, but
yeah, it's a little small too, but at least we can read it, that's for sure.
Okay, so hello, everybody. Thank you for making the time to listen to me speak here about identity and zero trust. Of course, it's always hard to follow up after Phil and all of his quantum discussion. I think one of the first things that it's worth recognizing today is that identity really is the new perimeter for organizations. It lacks clear boundaries in being a perimeter when we think historically as the perimeter to our network, and that's where we're going to apply all of our controls. But we've found through the last decade for sure that identity actually is the keystone to being able to perform effective security regardless of where the user is, regardless of what device they might be using, regardless of where your data or applications are stored. At the core of it, if you can't identify who's trying to access a resource, you don't really know what kinds of controls you need to put in place or additional capabilities you may want to run on their traffic, things like decryption. So as we think about identity, there's these 5 different buckets that I want to walk us through here. And really, we go from left to right in all of this. We have to start by identifying the user. And the challenges that we find across most organizations is the user is, it is on-prem, it's in cloud directories, it's in these employee databases that we hope are synchronizing and at regular frequencies and with fresh data and a whole bunch of other things. And when I look across the customers that we currently serve, about 87% of organizations have multiple IDPs. So it's not just that they have an Azure Active Directory that spans so many different things, and there are so many groups that are used for teams outside of security and for use cases which are no longer relevant, yet they still stay there, and permissions may even be attached to them. They're also synchronizing this up to Okta or to Azure. And then they had a merger and acquisition. And so now they have someone who's using Google IDP or maybe something homegrown. So there's a major challenge just in the spread of where all this information is found. And then actually granting users access to resources and applications gets its own whole challenge. Passwords are known to be insecure. Strong authentications have vulnerabilities. We've heard plenty at this point about SMS as a not so secure methodology for a second factor. More recently, we've all learned that notification bombing is a real problem for many organizations, where someone just keeps pushing notification. An attacker has the username and password, they attempt to log into a resource, and then they're prompted with a second factor challenge. And so they just continuously request the prompt to be sent to the legitimate user, who eventually gets annoyed and just allows them in. So 49% of all the breaches that we see are starting with these sorts of credential compromises. And then once the credentials are accepted, access is determined based on certain user information and not their actual actions. What do we mean by this? Well, among many organizations, if they're using policies based on information other than IP addresses in the first place, it's usually based on the role of the user. And so what they're effectively saying, though they don't mean to, is that I can determine what access that user should have to resources right now, pretty much just based on what I find on their business card. But we know user behavior leads to all sorts of risks. And many products are starting to calculate this now, but it's not shared across them. And so there's a ton of money which is lost due to insider threat, but oftentimes it's even hard to calculate because we're not totally sure where that's happened, many organizations. And even the most sophisticated organizations are facing this threat. Not long ago, a gentleman was sentenced to federal prison. He was exfiltrating key code from Google through Apple Notes and iCloud. And so this is a person who was legitimately hired by the business, had been otherwise doing their job, and were exfiltrating data as an insider threat. And even if we were to solve that, accessing enforcement is different for each product. And the potential for misconfiguration between different products leads to serious gaps in the expected enforcement. So one of the ways to think about this is you write some set of policies, or your CISO writes some set of policies, and their team go, this is what we want to have happen in our organization. But there's a gap between what they wrote and the policies as they're implemented within individual tools. And as one tool needs to start to create some exclusive permissions for a specific group or people, that starts to lead into gaps between those toolings. And IT teams, reasonably trying to get the business continuing to function, will oftentimes also help those barriers and start to create even more of a gap between these different toolings. We find that about 45 security tools are purchased by the average enterprise. So each one of these, along all of their dimensions, can become misaligned. And lastly, at a very fundamental level, securing one component doesn't secure the network. And so all aspects of the network must be secured. And we see that 33% of enterprises are breached each year. All of this, again, starts back with knowing who the user is and granting them access to resources and applications based on more information than just what you might find on a business card. And the way that we're able to help organizations with this challenge is by consolidating all of the identity information across the portfolio down into our cloud identity engine. And with the cloud identity engine, we're taking that information from directory stores, like the user's attributes and their values. We're taking risk information, for instance, from Azure Active Directory, now Entra ID, where they provide risk scores for users, high, medium, and low. And they provide the reasons why they're actually high, medium, or low today. And so based on that information, we come in and create brand new groupings of users that are dynamically changing on the fly as those values and attributes change. And then that would be reflected across the whole portfolio. We operate as the service provider for authentications, so you can ensure that whether you're using Global Protect or need a step-up authentication, that the user is, you can have higher confidence the user is who they are. And then finally, we're collecting and distributing key information data like the IP username, the user tag, the IP tag, and a bunch of other datas through the Cloud Identity Engine to ensure consistent policy enforcement, regardless of where the user is situated and where your data is situated. And all of this is done through our Cloud Identity Engine. And so this identity platform ultimately unifies, simplifies, and secures that access. Things are getting more complicated, and organizations are struggling to really focus in on where their highest points of leverage are. And identity, being a perimeter itself, and perhaps the perimeter ultimately, is a phenomenal place to focus energies and ensure that you're getting a consistent enforcement across the entire platform and your network. And so we have integrations into firewalls, IoT security, as well as Prisma and XDR. And we scale like mad. We have over 7,000 customers. Our largest directory that we've synchronized from a single customer who has 1.5 million groups. So if you think that your directory woes are challenging, I'm confident they have their challenges, but you don't have 1.5 million groups, probably. So know that for whatever your woes are, there are those who have more challenges. But on that very note, the Cloud Engine simplifies the entire distribution of this data because we only send the data required based on the policies on the firewall or Prisma Access. So you can be a customer with 1.5 million groups and still just have those groups that are necessary for policy enforcement to arrive on the enforcement point of the firewall or Prisma Access. And our largest directory as well, a different customer has 4.7 million users. So able to synchronize those as well. Getting a little more into the nuts and bolts here. How do you actually deploy identity with Palo Alto Networks? How do you ensure that in your zero trust journey, where identity is the keystone, where it is the new perimeter, they are able to utilize the Cloud Identity Engine effectively across all of the pieces of our portfolio? Step one always is to bring your IDP. We have tons and tons of options here. You're able to do direct integrations with Azure AD, now Entra ID. You can do it with Okta, Google IDP, with Ping. We provide SCIM and SCIM support as well, so that if you have your own or would like to connect to one of these using SCIM, you can also connect to all of those. And then you can synchronize that data with the Cloud Identity Engine. And we're synchronizing users, groups, devices, applications, as well as risk scores. We're synchronizing all of these approximately every 5 minutes. If there's not an ongoing synchronization, we'll just start a new one to make sure we're always up to date. And then that gets distributed out to the platform. Then you go into whatever tool you want. That's the next-gen firewall, Prisma Access, software firewalls, XDR, XIM, CDSS, and you write your policies. And as you're writing these policies, the source user and group section will autofill with the available groups. You can select the ones that you like, and once you commit, those will be sent to the device or service. Now that we have policies based on users, we're already a long way to ensuring zero trust. The next piece here is to authenticate those users as they're joining the network. Global Protect, our authentication portal, we can observe authentications occurring on your domain controllers. In each of these cases, there's additional component to configure. If you're going to be doing authentication through Global Protect or authentication portal, that IDP that you brought earlier will continue to work. There's a single configuration that you set up next to allow the Cloud Identity Engine to operate as the service provider for that authentication. In the case you're using AD or NAC or wireless, we have an agent you can deploy or use the built-in capabilities within the firewall itself. Then customers can start to access applications and resources based on their username, their group, all of this sort of information. And finally, as you mature through that, you can start to do continuous evaluation of user access by updating these with first and third party data. And that's where that risk information coming in through risk information, as well as attributes coming from these different data stores come into play. Within the Cloud Identity Engine, being able to create your own groupings that don't get synchronized back to those directory stores. There's many organizations I've spoken to who, when they want to have a new group created, it'll take them anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months to have that actually created from their identity team. So if that sounds anything like you, Cloud Identity Engine has the ability to, based on the groups and users and data that was synchronized, create your own groupings. So you can say a user whose title includes engineering and whose risk is high. And the reason why their risk is high is that their password is found on the dark web. That can be a group you can create right there. No need to ask the identity team to help you figure out how that would be built within their system, if it's even possible. So we can move more into this continuous evaluation of user access where, depending on new data coming in, their access and permissions to resources are changing on the fly. So I want to tell you as well a little bit about this multi-authentication capability. It's one which is very powerful. And the more people I speak to about it, the more they say, gosh, I wish I'd understood that this existed before. One of the big trends that we've seen in workforce onboarding is changing the way that people authenticate. In hybrid work, enterprises are going to a remote first workforce even today, as people move back into the office in many organizations, including Palo Alto Networks. there's still lots of opportunities to work from home, and much of our workforce likely won't become an office workforce again. We have multiple authentication types. As I mentioned earlier in the conversation, a majority of enterprises have 2 or more authentication types. This might be due to engineering teams having their own specific authentication outside of the normal corporate, due to a merger and acquisition, where now you have a second authentication source for these new employees to you, or other circumstances as well. And then multiple IDPs. They're not only using different authentication types, but even from entirely different IDPs. So in these circumstances, how can you ensure that the user is who they claim to be and enforce a second factor when necessary, while not overburdening yourself with having to duplicate, triplicate, or more all of the different policies that you have? Well, in an ideal circumstance, you'd be able to put the different types of authentication into a singular profile like you would today. And that's exactly what multi-auth profiles do. You're able to customize authentication experience on a per user or group level. So within the Cloud Identity Engine UX, you're able to come in, authentication type in a profile. And then from there, you're given a list of all of the authentication types that you've created, all of the different directories you have integrated, and you're able to select individual groups to be able to put them into, to determine which authentication type they should go to. So in a very specific example, you have a set of users who should go to Okta to authenticate, and another set of users who should go to Entra ID. Within that authentication profile you create within CIE, you would specifically call out which groups of users would go to each, and the end user experience would be relatively seamless. They would just end up where they need to go. And so the reason we're able to do this is by leveraging the Cloud Identity Engine's cloud authentication service. And this is available today on Next-Gen Firewalls Management and Global Protect as well. How do you? It's actually as simple as this. You create your new authentication profile, and then you assign the different groups that you desire. So on the top here, we can see we have a profile name. You're selecting that this is a multi-auth. You then select which kinds of auth types you want to include in this multi-auth profile. Here we have 2 different SAML providers, as well as a client certificate. So you can mix them and match them. And then we have 4 different directories that are available, each with 1,000 groups in this case. We can go into each one of these and select individual groups and then assign them to one of these SAML methodologies or the client cert. So it's a very straightforward process. And after saving this, it's a profile just like you're used to single auth profiles. And when you go to create a custom authentication experience, the user logs into the same portal type. And so in here, we see one example where you have a product management employee and a Palo Alto Networks contractor who are both coming through the same way. You have a username, whether they have a smart card or something else. And then finally, they're directed to where they should be. The product manager is going to the Google IDP, and the contractor ends up going to Azure. So the user flow for the end user looks pretty much the same. In addition to that, their experience is what they expect. They put in their username, they end up on the place they're supposed to go. They perform their authentication, and as long as it was successful, they're able to access their resources as defined by policy. So I'm going to try and show a little demo here.
Hey everybody, my name is Arshad Vishan. I'm a product manager on the identity team at Palo Alto Networks. I'm here with Imran Bashir, Principal Technical Marketing Engineer, to talk about our new multi-authentication support in Cloud Identity Engine as part of the new PAN-OS release. As a reminder, what is Cloud Identity Engine? Well, Cloud Identity Engine enables you to consistently authenticate and authorize your users regardless of where user identity stores live. This cloud-native engine empowers you to effortlessly allow access to applications and data everywhere to quickly move towards a zero trust security posture, all using a point-and-click configuration with real-time identity synchronization. But what's new in CIE? Well, we have several important developments in the world of CIE, including support for Okta and Google Identity Cloud Directories, integration with Prisma Access and Global Protect for enforcing identity-based security and authentication, and extended visibility into users and group networks products to correlate threats to users. But today, we'll be focusing on our new multi-authentication support, which will allow our PAN-OS customers to authenticate via a SAML-based IDP, certificate-based authentication, or a mix of both, depending on the user's group identity. There are a few trends in the field that necessitate changing the way that we authenticate users. First, so we want to be able to support multiple.
Let's see if we can't get to the actual demo part of this. So I've already covered many of these slides. There we go.
Multiple authentication types using SAML or certificate, all from a centrally managed cloud instance. My name is Imran Bashir, and I'm a principal technical marketing engineer at Palo Alto Networks. Now let's go through the demo of multi-authentication feature with Cloud Identity Engine. We also have a detailed demo that walks through step-by-step configuration of the entire feature. So in this case, you can see that I have one of my Azure IDP, which is a Cloud IDP edit, and we're pulling users and devices and groups, which can be used in the security policy configuration on the firewall to author context-based policies on the firewall. Now, we also have configured one of the authentication types as SAML. This is again talking to Azure AD as the SAML provider.
Hey, Jerry,
and then
can you
that's
pause
how
this for a second, please?
have a number of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there any chance we can actually get this any larger? People are having a hard time seeing this.
Yeah, let me try to see if there's a different way to share my screen here.
If you can, like, maybe just full screen the YouTube video and then just share that out, possibly.
Yeah, let me see if I can share my whole screen instead of a window or a tab. So if I share my entire screen, can you see this now?
That's significantly better, yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for noting that.
No
I'll
problem.
just keep it on the shared full screen in that case for the rest of the presentation.
Cool, thanks. Actually, when you, go ahead and stop sharing again. When you shared full screen, you didn't check the button that said enable audio. That's why.
Yeah, also share, window. To share audio, share a tab instead.
Yeah, you need to use either the first or third option. If you're going to share like your entire screen, you should be able to share the audio. Yeah, we're back small again.
No, it says I can't. Yeah, it says I can't. I'm sorry. I hit share screen, then I click on the window, and then it says to share audio, share a tab instead.
Yeah. Do you also have an option to share full screen?
It has an entire screen share option.
Yeah, if you choose that, you should then be able to turn on your audio.
Instead. Okay, I'll click share. Okay, and now what do I need to do to share the audio?
No, on that screen where you are prompted to share the screen, there should be a checkbox at the bottom right that says enable system audio.
There's not a checkbox for that. There's only a checkbox for that on the Chrome tab option.
Okay. Well, then that's what we're going to have to go with then, unfortunately. So one of the
Trevor Coates saying,
Trevor did mention
zooming into
the browser that
Let's
works for him. If everybody else could try that as well, then our apologies here. So.
On the firewall. Now, we also have configured one of the authentication types as SAML. This is again talking to Azure AD as the SAML provider, and then that's authentication. We have a number of demos in terms of how to set up a SAML with IDP providers, Azure and others. So feel free to take a look at that if you're interested in how to configure this. And the detailed demo also covers the entire configuration. Now, what we have added in this new release of Cloud Identity Engine is basically the ability to even start adding certificates and multi-authentication profiles. So I'll start with adding a CA chain. Now, CA chain is by any intermediate cert that you can get from your own CA or certificate authority provider. Or if you don't have one, then for lab testing, you can use one of the firewall and generate those certificates. And we go through that steps how to configure that. So in my case, we'll just go and add a chain. So we'll call it multi-auth chain. We'll click on upload. And then this is the chain that includes both the, let's click on open and we'll submit it. And you can see that this chain includes the root and the intermediate certificate, which is generated by one of my firewall instance in my lab. Now, the next thing we want to do is create authentication types. So we already have SAML added as authentication type. We can now add certificate authentication as well as a new type. So let's go and click on setup. We'll just call it any name. So let's call it multi-auth cert. Subject name or anything you want to use in the field, I'll just go with the subject. And in the user attribute, we'll just go with the CN or common name of the field. Now over here, I can add the chain that I added earlier. So it's right here, multi-auth chain. Click on add. And that's it. We'll submit it. Now you have two authentication types, SAML as well as client certificate profile. The next thing we can do is that we can go under authentication profiles and we can add an authentication profile. Let's call it the multi-auth profile. In the mode, we support both single authentication and multiple authentication. For example, if you just want to use SAML or just want to use certificate, then you can just go with single. But in our case, we'll do a combination of SAML and a certificate. So we'll go with multiple type. The directory sync attribute is the attribute that you added when you basically were configuring SAML authentication type. So in this case, I selected UPN to be returned by the SAML provider. So we'll go with UPN. And in the group, I selected the name. So I'll just go with the name. Now over here, you can see that we have two of the authentication types added in the previous step, and it shows both the type. Depending on what is the order that you would like, you can also control the order. For example, if I want the cert authentication to go first, I can simply move it, and that becomes the first provider. We also have a default authentication type option. For example, you're doing certificate authentication, but that's not working. So in that case, you can go and default and select the authentication type, or you can just do none if that's not interested. So let me go select both of, and then I can do none, or I can do multi-auth, or I can do Azure AD. So I'll just select Azure AD. So in my case, if the certificate doesn't work, I can still authenticate by using SAML. Now, in the last step, basically what you can do is you can assign the groups that have been learned from the Cloud IDP to your SAML type. So I'll just go and click on this. And I can see that there are a number of groups inside this Cloud IDP provider. So you can select all, or you can simply go and select one group. So in my case, employee, and I'll assign it to the Azure Active Directory. So when they're doing SAML authentication, they'll be using this group from the Azure Directory, and just click on submit. And that's about it. In few clicks, you are able to go and create a multiple authentication profile that can be now used on a firewall policy to start authenticating users. So now if I go to the firewall, simply go under device and go under authentication profile, click add, and let's call it the multi-auth profile. Now, since this is all being fetched from your Cloud INT instance, I can go and select the option as Cloud Authentication Service. The region would be Americas. That's where we added our Cloud INT region instance. We'll see all the profiles, and this is the profile we just added, multi-auth. And then under the profile name, this is the multi-auth profile that includes both SAML and certificate. We can also go to advanced and select the users. As you click on add, you can see all these users are returned by your Cloud IDP provider. You can select one group or multiple group. In our case, let's be selective. Since we only added employee, I'll just click on employee and click on OK. And that's it. Now you can start using these authentication profiles, start authenticating users with certificates as well as SAML on the network. And this could be applied to hundreds and thousands of firewalls because this is all being fetched from the cloud. This concludes the demo. Thank you for watching.
I'll stop sharing there, and then I'll start doing my share screen of the entire screen,
Sure.
as we won't need the audio for the next part.
Yeah. And then I'll just get the link from you afterwards to share out to the rest of the attendees for that video, Jerry, if we could. We did have a question come in that does the Cloud Identity Engine have a dependency on a specific PAN-OS version?
One.
And it turns out William just literally said the exact same thing in the chat. That was exactly it. So 10.1, thank you.
Any other questions before we continue? Because at this point, we'll move on to something quite different, but all still related to identity and zero trust.
Yep, that was it for the questions at the moment. Feel free to go on.
Great. And so with that, we can talk for legacy applications. Passwords are the #1 exposed attack vector in public breaches. We've mentioned this a couple of times in this conversation. Compromised credentials lead to 49% of publicly attributed cyber attacks. Folks use these in multiple different ways. They bypass your strong authentication with vulnerabilities, with men-in-the-middle reverse proxies. They intercept text messages with the MFA challenges. They bombard users with those MFA bombing, causing that fatigue, and then the user just clicks the button anyway. Malware can steal specific authentication session cookies from the browser itself. The attackers are now getting around some of these strong authentication methods. And it's become clear to the industry that we need something new. What we've been doing in the past is not going to work in the future. And so passwordless has become the thing that most people are talking about. I'm sure on LinkedIn, you see plenty of things about passwordless, just like I do. There's talk across all sorts of different vendors about passwordless. And if the virtues are so great of passwordless, then why isn't everyone just moving right away? Well, part of the challenge is, much like Phil Kwan had mentioned about quantum cryptography, it takes time to actually test and understand, test, and implement these technologies. But more fundamentally, there are 3 major challenges that we see. There's a lack of supported devices. Passwordless is not really possible today with a mixed set of endpoints between Windows, Mac, all the different flavors of Linux. Identity providers like Okta and Azure and others. Now, we just mentioned that 90% of organizations have 2 or more IDPs. So you're in a mixed environment with endpoints. You're in a mixed environment with identity providers. And in that sort of a circumstance, there's insufficient support. There's a lack of support on the application side of things. 40% of enterprise apps still require passwords, and many of them are on-prem or in private data centers requiring legacy authentication. Organizations I speak to, ranging from manufacturers to financials to education, they all tell me very similar stories. They have some piece of software or even some operational technology which relies on software that is anywhere from 1 year old to 40 years old. And those that are closer on the 40-year-old side don't have the abilities to use even some of our stronger authentication attackers are getting around today, let alone any sort of roadmap for getting passwordless authentication into them. And then there's that cost, the cost of migrating legacy applications, which can be migrated at all. With today's solutions, these apps can't adopt password authentication, and so then they have to replace them. And this ends up being a huge CapEx investment for the organization. Oftentimes, CapEx that the organization can't afford, or in the case that they even could afford it, the software has such a critical position in their entire business that to take it offline for some period is untenable. So what are folks to do in these situations? We all hopefully understand the core benefits of password authentication, even in the face of these challenges. We have an improved security posture because it prevents those commonly exploited identity attacks, whether that's credential compromise, MFA bypass, swapping, or any of the myriad others. It actually simplifies end user authentication experience. You get secure access with a single biometric scan without the need for a second factor coming through your mobile phone. People have said for some time, you can't get convenience and security, but passwordless tends towards the idea that you can when the appropriate technologies are put in place. And then there's the password management burden. Organizations spend tons of money on password management solutions alone just to try and help their end users become more secure by reducing the amount of passwords that they're using over and over again, which again just ends up in a yearly operational expense. And we already know that these are it's possible to compromise these, get around the security in place, and all, et cetera. So you're spending all of this money to not fully holistically solve the challenge. And so we now have a preview in our Quasar release of PenOS, a passwordless authentication for legacy applications. You can safely eliminate passwords now. By leveraging the IAM providers like Microsoft, Entra ID, and Okta, you're able to passwordlessly authenticate users through PenOS. So regardless of what managed endpoint that the user is on and where the actual data and applications and resources are, whether it's a SaaS app, SSO-enabled enterprise app, or one of these legacy apps that I alluded to, in all of these cases, you'll still be able to get the same protections of a passwordless authentication at the level of the firewall. So you have seamless passwordless access across all of the managed endpoints, and wherever the application is, you have a stronger security posture at risk of credential compromise and illegitimate access. And you've greatly simplified management by removing the management of password lifecycle, all of the auditing, and the responding to all of the credential compromise, which is a more hidden cost within your IT team anytime there is a credential compromise, anytime that there is unauthorized access. And we do have a demo for passwordless here. This time, if we can still get
Audio while making it large.
no, still says share a tab. Okay. Well, let me see. What if I do it like this? That's still.
It's not too bad. That's fine. Yeah, so powerful, but not bad. Yeah.
Passwords are the number one exposed vector in MFA challenges from a user. Customers can leverage life cycles initiated and effortless. This enables our customers to achieve a stronger security posture by removing the risk of credentials being compromised and eliminating any illegitimate access. This immensely simplifies the management of credentials by removing the pain of managing password life cycles, auditing access, and responding to credentials compromise scenarios. Let's look at a high level demo workflow. So in this case, the user authenticates to the machine via passwordless by either using PIN or fingerprint or any key. Once the user is authenticated in the machine, the Global Protect will get initiated and will start a network authentication to your IAM provider. So the request goes through the firewall, through Cloud ID Engine, to your IAM provider, which is Okta in this case, and that completes the authentication. Once the is sent back to the client, and now the client can access applications passwordlessly. The next thing, the user opens a browser and access the internet and SaaS application. Now, if the contract is there for a single sign-on between your SaaS application IAM, then this should work seamlessly, and user should be able to access any SaaS application which are provisioned by the enterprise. Now, finally, the user opens the browser and tries to access legacy application which are on-prem. Now, in this case, we're using WordPress, which is a Kerberized application. But please note that there's no Kerberos token on the client itself because its client is not part of the realm. So when the client tries to access the application, the request goes to Palo Alto's proxy. That is where the Palo Alto proxy does a constrained delegation. So it gets the ticket on behalf of the user and saves it here. Now, as the user accesses these applications, the user has now access to these applications using passwordless authentication. Let's see how this works in the demo. So in this case, the client authenticates to the machine using passwordless authentication. And there are multiple methods to authenticate, for example, using an authenticator or simply using a PIN. We'll just use a PIN because we're using a VMware machine over here. Once you're in, then depending again on the authenticator type, you will have access to various resources on the network. So in this case, the Global Protect detects network authentication, and it'll walk the user through the network authentication. Again, this is tied to backend with Okta, so you're going to SAML authentication to get network access. Now, if you're using the authenticator, for example, fingerprinting or the built-in hardware authenticator, then you might not get this prompt, and it's all Okta setting. But let's click on authenticate, and we might be asked to enter the PIN again. So enter the PIN. And that's it. Your authentication is complete, and GlobalProtect is telling you that you have network access. Now, if we look at the client should have access to internet and all the SaaS application, whichever SaaS application has contract or setting with Okta as per your enterprise policies. So there you go, you can get access. Now let's try to access an application that is legacy on-prem Kerberos application. In this case, we're using WordPress. Now please note that the client does not have Kerberos token to access it, but we were still able to get into the application by using passwordless and leveraging the authentication that we did earlier. Let's log out and try to authenticate again by a single sign-on, and you'll see that the authentication did earlier with SAML for passwordless authentication still works and you have network access. Let's also try to access the admin portal, and you can see that the client also has access to the admin portal. This concludes the demo. Thank you for watching.
Awesome. And the final thing I wanted to, we started this conversation discussing how understanding who the user is, and then understanding understanding who they are, what confidence we have that they are who they say they are, and then finally controlling their access to resources based on more information than what you might just find on a business card. And with our we're newly introducing a set of systems called the Security Risk Engine. And with the Security Risk Engine, we're taking those third-party datas about users and potentially in the future, even application risk signals, bringing this into the Cloud Identity Engine and being able to create groupings based on that. We've already started this with our dynamic user groups and the ability to take in risk scores from Azure. We have additional things coming in the very near future for devices and additional sources for user risk. And then based on that, you can go ahead and create policies for quarantining, blocking, limiting access, revoking information, stepping up authentication, and more. And so this whole process for end users will be entirely automated, and administrators can set each component of this. So with that, I think that concludes my presentation today.
Fantastic. Yeah, we did have one question that actually came from the Cloud Identity Engine portion. I just didn't want to break your train of thought while we were going through things. The question is from the user experience side, do they need GlobalProtect? I would presume yes, but just want to make sure.
Yeah, so for Cloud Identity Engine, GlobalProtect is not required. You can still collect IP user mappings from other sources, like your on-prem Active Directory or network access controllers. And that's the data that we require in order to actually enforce policies based on group information. If you wanted to use the step-up authentication and the multi-auth capability, you can still use that with our authentication portal built into the firewall itself. So you would add that to a policy, and if the user's unknown, or perhaps if they're in a group that you want to force to have a step-up, you can cause them to have to go through that authentication flow before gaining access to resources. So GlobalProtect, of course, is excellent in that it will give that IP user mapping automatically, and it forces them through that authentication flow. It's not required in order to use these Cloud Identity Engine capabilities.
Fantastic. I stand corrected in my comment then, so great. All right. That was all the questions we had. If anyone does have anything, got a moment or so to throw it in there. Just want to say thank you to Jerry. Greatly appreciated. I got a follow-up question here of, So is it possible to integrate it with SSO? Specifically, they mean Windows SSO?
Depends a little bit on what you mean by that phrase. So happy to take that one offline and get an answer to you.
This would be a perfect example of something to take over into the live community chat afterwards. So that's exactly what it's there for. Jerry, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Phil, if you're still around, thank you as well for your time. Both of you have been a fantastic, great source of information, great just technical information left and right. Of just, for me, I've really enjoyed this very much.